Good evening. Let me start by giving some background about me. I am an engineer who happened to spend 7 years of my career in Mexico, where I built and then ran a power transformer manufacturing business in Guanajuato. I also happen to be the great-nephew of Alfred Maudslay. In addition, I'm currently the chairman of the British Mexican Society. These various factors combine together to inspire me to prepare this talk, with a great deal of encouragement, I have to say, from Ana Elena González Trevino, the director of UNAM UK. This is not a talk which will go into detail about Alfred's archaeological discoveries. Others are much better qualified than I to do that. Instead, it will chronicle his life, explain what led him to Mexico and Central America, and assess what have been his enduring legacies. Some family history will help to explain how Alfred acquired sufficient wealth to finance so many archaeological expeditions. His grandfather, Henry Maudslay, my great-great-grandfather, became a successful and famous engineer during the early years of the Industrial Revolution at the beginning of the 18th century. He was known particularly for developing and then manufacturing lathes and other machine tools. We shall celebrate the 250th anniversary of his birth next year, 2021. One of his sons, who worked in Henry's business, was Joseph. Joseph also became a renowned engineer, principally remembered for making steam engines for ships. Alfred was the 7th of Joseph's 8 surviving children. My grandfather was the 3rd. Wealth from this business gave Alfred the resources to fund his archaeological expeditions. Alfred was born on the 18th of March 1850, close to London. He attended Harrow School, where he claims he didn't excel other than in the making of maps. In 1868, he went up to Cambridge to read natural sciences. He graduated in 1872 and then enrolled as a medical student. Before starting his medical studies, he persuaded his brother Charles to accompany him to the West Indies because he wanted to see a tropical forest. They sailed first to Jamaica, then on to Panama. There they took a train across the isthmus before sailing to San Jose, Guatemala. They then went by mule to Escuintla, followed by a 2-week trip, again on muleback, to the Guatemalan highlands, including Antigua and the Lake of Atitlan. After returning to the coast, they sailed to San Francisco. From there, they went first by train, then by horse-drawn coach to Yosemite. They shared the coach with a party of ladies from the East, including Mrs. Gouverneur Morris and her 2 daughters, one of whom would, many years later, become his wife. After Yosemite, they traveled on to Salt Lake City, and then, in the Morris' private rail car, to Niagara. They finally arrived home in early December. Alfred returned to Cambridge to continue his medical studies, but he was much affected by coughs and colds, so he decided to give up university and flee to the tropics. In January 1874, he set sail for the West Indies. His intention had been to grow tobacco in Jamaica, but by chance, he met William Cairns, the incoming governor of Trinidad, who offered him the role of private secretary. Cairns was then appointed governor of Queensland in Australia, so Alfred accompanied him there, also as private secretary. Sometime later, Alfred moved from Queensland to Fiji, where he became private secretary to the governor there, Sir Arthur Gordon. Sir Arthur's extensive interest in ethnographic artifacts rubbed off on Alfred, who collected various items from the Pacific to take home to England. In his role as private secretary, he made extensive tours of Samoa and Tonga and was then promoted to consul general. This is a photograph he took of his house in Tonga. After 6 years, realizing there was unlikely to be much career progression for him in the colonial service, he resigned. By late 1880, Alfred was again bound via Trinidad and Jamaica to British Honduras, which we now call Belize, before sailing to Livingston in Guatemala. This small port at the mouth of the Rio Dulce was where passengers transshipped to a small stern-wheel paddle steamer for the journey up Lake Isabel. This was the same route taken 40 years earlier by the renowned travellers John Lloyd Stephens and Frederick Catherwood, who were on their way to Copan and Quirigua. Alfred had with him the exciting volumes written by Stephens and illustrated by Catherwood. After landing at Isabel, he procured a guide and some mules and set off for Quirigua. This map of the region will help you to get your bearings. Quirigua is towards the bottom of the map. Once arrived at Quirigua, he cleaned moss and other vegetation off the stele and took photos on the large glass plate negatives he'd brought with him. So began the 20-year phase of exploring Mayan sites, which was to include 7 trips in total, including 3 further visits to Quirigua. As the cleaning of the stones revealed ever more inscriptions, Alfred became determined that these should be preserved by means of both photography and detailed drawings. This approach contrasted vividly with that of his predecessors, who had either produced general, albeit often beautiful drawings, such as this one by Catherwood, or had merely taken away pieces of ruins for collectors or museums in Europe or the US. After a brief stay in Quirigua, he rode on, despite problems with the arrieros, mule drivers, to Copan. Here he took more photographs before continuing to Guatemala City. His next stop was Antigua, from where he climbed the Volcán de Agua. Sadly, the cloud was too heavy at the top for good photographs, although he did photograph this general view of the volcano. Many more days in the saddle, crossing rivers by canoe with the mule swimming alongside, eventually led him to Tikal. By the time he arrived there, he had amassed a workforce totaling 22 mozos. Although he only had a week to spare at these ruins because he needed to catch a steamer in early May from Belize, he was able to clear the surroundings of what we now call Temples 1, 2 and 3, and also take some wonderful photographs. Following less than 6 months in England, he set sail again in mid-November 1881, retracing the steps of his journey with his brother several years earlier. This included crossing the Isthmus of Panama on land before sailing to San Jose, Guatemala. From there, he travelled by the new railway to Escuintla and on by mule to Guatemala City. As an interlude, prior to returning to Quirigua, he climbed Volcán de Fuego with a Swiss doctor and a team of porters. In his diary, Alfred recalled how cold it was camping for the night at 11,000 feet, 3,350 meters. On arriving at Quirigua, he was pleased to see that the team of mozos he had sent in advance had cleared vegetation from much of the ruins. The mozos were led by Gorgonio Lopez, who was to become Alfred's trusted assistant on future expeditions. Here's a photo of Gorgonio, which Alfred took some 18 years later at Palenque. Much intricate cleaning of the sculptures was required before good photos could be taken, but the glory revealed was well worth the effort. This is Alfred's photo of Zoomorph P. While in Guatemala City, Alfred had met a surveyor who told him of an interesting unexplored ruined city on the Rio Usumacinta. So, after finishing the season's original objectives at Quirigua, Alfred and his party, which consisted of Gorgonio Lopez, 2 of Gorgonio's brothers, plus 13 mozos, set off in early March to find it. After 15 days' travel, the party then arrived at what we now know as Yaxchilan. Here is one of his photos of Yaxchilan, followed by a present-day view. A few days later, the French travel writer and explorer Désiré Charnay arrived. Charnay, who had been hoping to discover a new city to include in his forthcoming book, was not best pleased to find another European ahead of him, but, as Charnay relates in his journal, we shook hands, he knew my name, he told me his, and, as my looks betrayed the inward annoyance I felt, he said, "It's all right. There's no reason why you should look so distressed. My having had the start of you was mere chance, as it would have been the other way round. You may dispense with mentioning my name, if you so please." "I was deeply touched by his kind manner," said Charney. "We lived and worked like two brothers on the site, and we parted the best of friends in the world." Alfred learnt from Charney the technique of making papier-mâché molds of carvings. Some years later, Alfred sent Gorgonio Lopez and his brothers back to Yaxchilan with instructions to make paper molds of lintels. These are now in the British Museum's collection. Here is one of Alfred's photos from Yaxchilan. In preparation for his next expedition the following year, 1883, Alfred studied the making of plaster casts. He realized that plaster of Paris rather than paper molds would be better able to reproduce fine detail, especially in large curved carved objects. He engaged a renowned expert in the making of plaster molds of classical statues, Lorenzo Giuntini, to assist him. Giuntini was later to make an excellent bust of Alfred, which is in the British Museum. The process of preparing the large monuments for plaster casting was arduous. Trees and other vegetation had to be cleared. Up to 1 metre of alluvial silt had to be dug away. Quirigua is near a river which floods. And moss and lichen had to be scrubbed off. In addition to having Giuntini do the plaster moulding, Alfred had engaged a qualified surveyor to prepare detailed plans of the site. Alfred himself was the expedition's photographer. Giuntini's greatest achievement during this trip was the moulding of the Great Turtle, which required 600 separate sections using around 2 tons of plaster, all of which had to be carefully packed for the long journey back to London. In parallel with Giuntini's reassembly of these moulds in London to produce a cast, Alfred started to look around for a route to publish the results of his work, including all the photographs, sketches and site plans. His old friend, Osbert Salvin, offered to include them in a major work he was preparing on the natural history of Central America. I will return to that publication later in this talk. Continuing with his meticulous planning and the investment of large sums of his own money, Alfred again embarked for Central America, arriving in Copan in January 1885. A thatch shelter was built near the Acropolis, while Alfred adopted an old prison cell in the local village as his photographic darkroom. Here's a picture of one of the stelae in Copan. During this season's excavations, war broke out between Guatemala and Honduras on one side and El Salvador and Nicaragua on the other. Nearly all Alfred's labourers were called away, unwillingly, to serve as soldiers. When the war finished, one of the Honduran generals visited the site while he was touring the area looking for illicit stills. Alfred took a photograph of the general and his entourage. At the end of 5 months, the paper moulds of the inscriptions, along with 1,400 plaster cast sections, had to be packed and transported in boxes to the port of Izabal. Alfred's next trip, which commenced in October 1887, took him to the highlands of the Petén region. Here, because of the absence of good maps, he made use of astronomical surveying instruments that had been lent to him by the Royal Geographical Society. During this trip, he explored Ixcún and Yaxché. At Yaxché, one of the mozos shot a howler monkey for food. It turned out to have a baby, which adopted Alfred after he fed it with condensed milk obtained from some mahogany loggers camped nearby. Alfred chose Chichen Itza for his 1889 field season. The trip didn't start well. Much of the moulding paper was damaged by seawater during the journey. A further problem for Alfred was the booming demand for binder twine in the USA, which required huge quantities of Yucatan sisal, which in turn drove up the demand for the labourers Alfred needed on site. He eventually found sufficient labourers in Piste. They all went home to their village at night, leaving Alfred completely alone in the ruins. Later in the season, however, he was joined by Henry Sweet, an American photographer. It was Sweet who took the famous photo of Alfred in his quarters in the building we now call Las Monjas. Having Sweet with him was particularly useful when both were struck down with fever. As Alfred comments in his journal, both of our attacks fortunately occurred on alternate days, so we could take it in turns to be nurse and patient. These photos show then and now from Chichen and show the huge difference that has taken place. During his stay in Chichen, Alfred made a detailed survey of the site, remarkably accurate even when compared to modern surveys, and he did detailed dimensional drawings of various of the principal structures. He and Sweet also used the undamaged part of the moulding paper to good effect, especially to record the decoration of the lower chamber of the Temple of Jaguars. Their food started to run scarce by the end of June, so on the 2nd of July they struck camp and returned to Merida, ending the longest and most grueling of all Alfred's expeditions. 2 years later, in early 1891, Alfred returned to Mexico, this time to Palenque, which had been made famous by Stevens and Catherwood nearly 50 years before. Following a trip to Mexico City, he sailed from Veracruz to Laguna de Terminos, which is now known as Ciudad del Carmen. There he chartered a small steam-driven vessel to take him and his equipment up the Rio Usumacinta. He had with him a surveyor, Mr. Price, whom he had engaged in London. They disembarked at Monte Cristo, now known as Emiliano Zapata, then had to find pack mules to carry the equipment 40 miles to the ruins. As it turned out, the scarcity of mules meant that some equipment had to be carried by Highland Maya, who were returning to the Sierra after their annual trip to town to sell wild cacao and buy machetes and salt. Both this initial journey and a subsequent one to collect the remainder of his equipment from Monte Cristo were beset by problems with arrieros who were excessively fond of aguardiente. This photo gives an idea of the amount of clearing work needed on site. Alfred's trusted assistant, Gorgonio, together with his brother and son, arrived on horseback from Guatemala in early February 1891. They immediately set to work making paper molds of inscriptions in the temples, although much of their initial work had to be redone as it was ruined by a sudden unseasonal heavy rainstorm. Many of the inscriptions had incrustations of limestone created by decades of water filtering through the stonework above. This had to be chipped off, requiring hours of careful work with hammer and chisel. As with his previous ones, this expedition was not without its labor problems. Some weeks they had over 50 men on site, but other weeks none would appear. However, 2 small boys walked 6 miles from the village every day to bring them tortillas before being fortified by chocolate and sweet biscuits prior to starting their 6-mile journey home. Alfred was able to take extensive photographs while Mr. Price, the surveyor, completed a detailed plan of the site. These photos show the palace then and now, and also show one of Price's plans. Alfred and Price finally left the site in late April, following what had been a difficult mosquito-plagued season, but one rewarded with superb photographs. At least he didn't have to contend with the volcanic ash, which met me and my family on our first visit to Palenque in 1982, after the volcano nearby had exploded. Since their initial meeting in Yosemite, some 20 years previously, it appears that Alfred had kept in regular contact with the Morris family. It seems likely that he met them, particularly their daughter Annie, from time to time during these years, both when passing through New York and on summer trips to Europe. This culminated in Alfred's marrying Anne Carey Morris in Rome in May 1892, by which time Alfred was 42 and Annie 44. Annie was the granddaughter of the celebrated Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur was his first name, not his rank. Gouverneur Morris was a lawyer who served as American minister in Paris at the time of the French Revolution and had many exciting escapades there. In 1889, the Peabody Museum in the US, inspired by Alfred's work at Copan, decided to mount expeditions to do more work at this site. These took place in 1891-2 and 1892-3. The museum then invited Alfred to lead their third season. So, in early October 1893, Alfred and Annie embarked from Liverpool to New York. From New York, they went to Chicago to see the World Colombian exhibition, celebrating 400 years since Columbus's first trip to the New World. At this exhibition, which had been mounted in Seville the previous year, there was a Guatemalan pavilion that contained some of Alfred's plaster casts, along with large format prints of his photographs, 30 by 24 inches, which was huge at the time. From Chicago, they made their way by train to San Francisco, sailed to San Jose, Guatemala, then took the train to Guatemala City. They then commenced a sightseeing journey through the highlands en route to Copan. This included a trip to the top of Volcán de Agua, with Annie on her sure-footed mule and Alfred on a less sure-footed horse. They were accompanied by Gorgonio. When they couldn't find anywhere to sleep in one of the villages through which they passed, they pitched their tent. Some of the rooms they were offered as sleeping quarters were so full of mice and rats that the tent apparently seemed preferable. On several days they had to cross ranges of hills, ascending and descending several hundred feet, and ford many rivers at the bottom of barrancas. Even Annie's sure-footed mule found some of the descents difficult, and remember that she was riding side saddle, which must have made it an even greater challenge. They passed through Zacapa in late February 1894, from where Alfred wrote to my father while Annie wrote to my grandmother. In Alfred's letter, which enclosed some US and Guatemalan stamps for my father's collection, my father would at that time have been 13 years old, Alfred says, "Your Aunt Annie has ridden 400 miles on her little mule without any mishaps and has enjoyed it all thoroughly." He then goes on to list some of the many birds they've seen on their journey. Annie's letter to my grandmother describes some of the places where they spent the night, ranging from schoolrooms to a room in an old convent. She says, "I have cooked many breakfasts and dinners over my fire." By early March, they arrived at Copan, where Alfred took more photos, while Gorgonio and his sons were busy cleaning sculptures prior to making paper molds. From Copan, they rode to Quirigua, a journey made unpleasant by unseasonal heavy rains. They were only able to spend 2 weeks there before they had to leave for the coast to get a steamer for New Orleans. At Quirigua, Annie had acquired a baby brown squirrel, which she named Chico. It remained her much-loved pet for more than 2 years. In around 1898, Alfred took over an hacienda and small gold mine around 10 miles west of Oaxaca. They built a house close to the mine named Zavaleta and used that as their winter home until 1906. It appears that Alfred had hoped to carry out archaeological investigations at Monte Alban, some 90 minutes horse ride away from Zavaleta, but that proved impossible to arrange for various reasons. Here are photos of the inside of their house and of Annie in her hammock. I have a photo dating from their time at Zavaleta, which has on the reverse, in Alfred's writing, "The church at Quilapam, Annie and the mules under the tree." Here you can see the photograph, and here's a blow-up in which you can just see Annie and the mules. I also have 4 letters written by Alfred to his brother, Athel, my grandfather, during their winters at Zavaleta. These talk of Alfred's initial optimism for the mine then go on to detail his concerns following landslides during the summer rains and his worries about staff. He mentions the successful installation of an electric generator and how this made evenings in the house more pleasant. He talks about the challenges of creating an attractive garden in an area that has virtually no rain from November to April. Much watering was needed, he said. Sadly, it appears that the mine was never an economic success, leading to its eventual sale. On their departure from Zavaleta, Alfred and Annie took a house in San Angel, then quite separate from Mexico City, for the winter of 1906-07. Here he carried out research on what we now refer to as the Templo Mayor complex. In the early summer of 1907, they left Mexico, never to return to Central America. The 1894 expedition to Copan had been Alfred's seventh to the Mayan area, but was his last. The next task was to assemble all the photographs, drawings and plans such that they could be published. Alfred also needed to find a home for the casts made from his plaster and paper moulds. Some went to the Cambridge University Archaeological Museum, the rest to London's South Kensington Museum. Artists were employed to make careful drawings of the casts. One of these, artists who helped with the publication by colouring photographs, was Adela Breton, the sprightly gentlewoman from Bath. She had already travelled to archaeological sites in Mexico before being introduced to Alfred. Here is one of her stunning watercolours, which is now in the Bristol Museum. For publication, Alfred had accepted Goodman and Salvin's offer of a special section within their mammoth 67-volume series, Biología Central y Americana. Original copies of these large format, excellent quality volumes are now very expensive. There's currently one on sale for £25,000 if anybody's wondering what to give me for Christmas, but facsimile copies are available. In parallel with work on the Biología volumes, Alfred and Annie wrote A Glimpse at Guatemala. This is a beautifully produced volume printed on handmade paper with exquisite photographic reproductions. A modern facsimile version is readily available. Alfred and Annie had a comfortable townhouse in London, but wanted a base in the country for their retirement. Tours around in their new Maudslay car, built in the Maudslay Motor Company founded by Alfred's nephew, Cyril, enabled them to find what they wanted near Hereford. The house, called Morney Cross, commands a splendid view across the River Wye Valley. The present owners of the property found a slightly damaged stone carving of a cockatoo half buried in the grounds. It is reasonable to assume that this was something Alfred and Annie had commissioned, perhaps to commemorate a cockatoo they brought back from Central America. After settling in Morney Cross, Alfred resumed work on his translation of Bernal Díaz del Castillo's Historia Verdadera de la Conquista de Nueva España. This translation was published in 5 volumes. It's a splendid edition, which includes many photographs as well as fold-out maps and plans. Alfred worked from a copy transcribed by the Mexican historian Genaro Garcia from a photographic copy of the original held in Guatemala. Garcia had copied Diaz's original faithfully, preserving its archaic orthography and lack of punctuation. These factors made Alfred's task as a translator extremely taxing. Alfred also engaged in extensive discussions with the British Museum about displaying his casts. These eventually led to the opening of the museum's Maudslay Room in 1923. By the mid-1920s, Alfred and Annie were in their late 70s. Here's a picture of them, with him looking very like how I remember my father at that age. But by then, Annie's health had started to deteriorate, and sadly, she died on the 12th of September 1926. During the mid-1920s, Alfred was working on an abridged single-volume edition of Bernal Díaz's history, which has been reprinted many times and is still in print. He also wrote reminiscences of his time before he worked in Central America in a book entitled Life in the Pacific 50 Years Ago. On the 23rd of January 1931, Alfred died in his 81st year and was buried in Hereford Cathedral alongside Annie. There were extensive obituaries in the general press and also in specialist archaeological journals. All praised the excellence of his Mayan work, while those by colleagues and friends commented very positively on his charming manner coupled with his kind and gentle disposition. Following his death, most of his photographs went to the British Museum, his notebooks to the Royal Geographical Society, and his important collection of Guatemalan and Mexican textiles to the Victoria and Albert Museum. So what can we say were his greatest legacies from which we still gain benefit to this day? Firstly, his excellent plaster and paper molds and his glass negative photographs. The very high quality of all this work has stood the test of time. With the almost total decipherment of Mayan glyphs achieved since Alfred's deaths, the precision of these images enables glyphs to be read even where the original carvings in the field have weathered beyond recognition. It is wonderful that Google Arts and Culture has funded the recent digitization of this archive, thereby both preserving it and making it more readily available for future scholars. Secondly, the rigor of his site surveys, coupled with the establishment of geographical coordinates using celestial navigation, set standards which were not always exceeded until the advent of GPS. Thirdly, his comprehensive translation of Diaz's Historia de la Conquista, which is recognized as a masterpiece. And finally, his wonderful collection of Guatemalan and Mexican textiles, which I mentioned earlier. This resides in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Before I finish, I must make some acknowledgements. I must first acknowledge very sincerely Ian Graham's biography entitled Alfred, Maudslay and the Maya. This has been invaluable to me in the preparation of this talk, and I'm just so sad that Ian is no longer with us, as I'm sure that a double act between him and me could have produced a much more exciting talk. Secondly, I must also thank the British Museum and the V&A for making photos available on the web that I have used liberally. I shall leave you with the photograph that Annie and Alfred used at the end of their book, A Glimpse at Guatemala. Adios. Many thanks.